By the time she hit that record button, she had already lost. The bracelet was gone. The handshake had already happened. And somewhere in Harlem, a man who almost never speaks was about to say more in 60 minutes than he had said in 6 years of marriage. This wasn't a fight. This wasn't even a scandal. This was a public burial, and the woman digging the grave didn't realize she was standing in it until the dirt was already up to her neck. Remy Ma, the same woman the culture called untouchable, the same woman we crowned as the last real queen of New York, spent an entire weekend torching a decade-long marriage in real time, in front of millions, with pawn shop receipts flying and voice notes leaking and a Cartier bracelet doing more testifying than a federal witness. And the worst part? She thought she was winning. She thought she was in control. She thought the receipts she was pulling were going to save her. But every receipt she dropped was another shovel of dirt on her own casket, because on the other side of that timeline, Papoose was sitting there, calm as a Sunday morning, with 2 years of documentation, a hard drive full of voice notes, and the patience of a man who had already made peace with what he was about to do. Everything you think you know about this situation is wrong. Everything the blogs are telling you is the surface. The real story is not the affair. The real story is not the punch. The real story is what happens when a quiet man collects for 2 years and finally decides the pressure is too much. And when we get to the voice notes, and I promise you we are getting there, you are going to understand why this is not a divorce. This is a demolition. And Remy Ma built the building herself. Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like, and subscribe. Let's get into it. Now let me set the stage properly, because if you jumped in on Sunday when the receipts started flying, you missed the entire foundation of why this weekend hit the way it hit. For over a decade, Remy Ma and Papoose were sold to us as the last real black love story in hip-hop. That was the pitch. That was the brand. Prison letters. Wedding vows behind bulletproof glass. A man who waited 6 years while his woman served her sentence. Baby showers. Instagram anniversaries. Matching outfits at every award show. Reality TV moments where they cried on cue and reminded us what real love was supposed to look like in a culture that had forgotten. Every magazine cover called them the blueprint. Every podcast used them as the example. Every young couple in Harlem, in the Bronx, in Brooklyn, looked at those two and said, "That's what I want. That's what we should be building. That's the standard." And you bought it. I bought it. The entire culture bought it. And that is the single most important thing I need you to remember before we go one word further, because everything we are about to unpack was quietly rotting behind that picture the entire time. Every frame. Every post. Every anniversary caption. Every red carpet handhold. The rot was there. The rot was patient. And the rot had a name. It had a name that has now been whispered in industry circles for almost 2 full years, a name from the battle rap world, a name that walked into rooms Papoose was standing in, shook his hand, and walked out with a secret big enough to end everything. The stakes here are not just personal. The stakes are cultural. Because when the last real love story in hip-hop turns out to be a 2-year-long undercover operation, the entire culture has to sit down and ask itself a very ugly question. If they were faking it, who else is faking it? If the blueprint was a lie, what were we building on? And that question, whether you want to admit it or not, is the reason this story is bigger than Remy. Bigger than Papoose. Bigger than any bracelet or any battle rapper. This is about the entire machine that sells us love stories for engagement, packages them for streaming, and then quietly buries them when the ratings drop. So the real question you should be asking yourself as we walk through this weekend is not who was right and who was wrong. The real question is, how did we miss it for 2 years, and what does it say about the culture we are living inside of that we did? Let me walk you through the surface first, because the surface is where everybody else is stuck. The surface is where the blogs are. The surface is where the reaction pages are. The surface is where the fake analysts are pretending they understand what happened. But the surface is only the first layer, and I need you to see it in order, in the exact sequence it unfolded, so that when we get to the deeper stuff, you can feel how every piece connects. It started, as these things always do, with something small. 2 Harlem uncles, Cameron Giles and Mason Betha, better known to the world as Cameron and Maze, sat down on their podcast like 2 old heads at a barbershop and started breaking down the situation the way only Harlem legends can. And Cam wasn't hiding it. He said it plainly on the record. Both of them are his friends. He got no dog in the race. But he had to tell the truth about what he saw, because in his words, silence at this point would be a lie of its own. And what he saw was a marriage that had been dead for a long time, dressed up in designer clothes, walking around at events, waving at cameras, pretending to still have a pulse. That was piece number 1. That was the moment the internet leaned in. Because when Cam speaks on Harlem, Harlem listens, and when Harlem listens, the culture listens right behind it. Then came piece number 2. Claressa Shields walked into the breakfast club, sat down across from Charlemagne, and spoke. She did not name names. She did not throw a punch. She did not do a single thing that could be called disrespectful in a court of law. But she spoke, and sometimes speaking is the whole crime, because speaking confirms that you exist inside a story where somebody else desperately needed you to be invisible. And the second Claressa became visible, the entire marriage became visible in a way it was never supposed to be. Piece number 3 landed within hours. Remy went online. Not calmly. Not carefully. Scorched earth. Caps lock. Screenshots. Voice memos. Receipts flying so fast the timeline could not keep up. She hit Papoose with a shot about not seeing the kid. She pulled out pawn shop receipts about a Cartier bracelet that allegedly went missing. She turned her Instagram into a courtroom and appointed herself judge, jury, and executioner all at the same time. And that, right there, was the fatal error. Because when you go scorched earth in public, you invite the other side to bring their evidence in public too. And Papoose had evidence. Piece number 4 is where the whole thing broke open. Papoose, the same man who has stood next to Remy for a decade and barely said a full paragraph on camera, got on live and talked for a full hour. 60 minutes. Uninterrupted. Calm. Cold. Precise. And in those 60 minutes, he confirmed the battle rapper. He confirmed the timeline. He confirmed everything that had been whispered in industry circles for the last 2 years. But the part that hit hardest, the part that made the internet stop scrolling and start recording, was the handshake. Because Papoose said on live that this man, this battle rapper, walked up to him at an event, shook his hand, looked him in the eye, and gave him a 5 like they were 2 men in the same room and nothing else. And Papoose did not know. He shook that man's hand not knowing that the same hand had allegedly been all over his wife for years. And when he found out, something in him broke that could not be put back together. Because it was no longer just about an affair. It was about disrespect at a level that language cannot fully capture. And oh, do I have more for you? Because if you think the handshake was the ceiling, you have not been paying attention. The handshake was the floor. What is coming next is the part that turned this from a scandal into a case study, the part that made grown men in barbershops stop cutting hair to rewind the live, the part that Remy's fans are still trying to explain away as we speak. Because after the handshake, Papoose did something that a quieter man would never have done. He acted. Physically. In the real world. And after he acted, he came home and pressed play on something that Remy did not know he had. Something she said out loud, in her own voice, on a phone call she thought was private. And the moment he pressed play on that recording, the entire narrative Remy had spent the weekend building collapsed under its own weight. So if you are one of those people who came into this thinking Remy had the upper hand because she posted first, buckle in, because the person who posts first is almost never the person who wins, and this weekend proved that at a level the culture is going to be studying for years. Let me walk you through the cultural layer now, because this is where the story stops being gossip and starts being a mirror for the entire industry. Cam and Maze are not random voices. Cam and Maze are Harlem royalty, and when Harlem royalty sits down and calls out one of its own, the ripples do not stop at the Hudson. They travel. So when Cam laid out that the affair had been whispered about for 2 full years in industry circles, that was cultural evidence piece number 1, because Cam does not speak on rumors he cannot back. He speaks on rooms he has been in. Cultural evidence piece number 2 came from the way Claressa Shields' visit to the Breakfast Club was received. Because if you actually go back and watch that segment carefully, Claressa never disrespected Remy. She was measured. She was calm. She did not throw dirt. But the culture recognized instantly what was happening. The industry recognized it. And within hours, comment sections across every hip-hop platform were filled with fans who were not asking, is this true, but asking, how long has this been true, and why is nobody surprised? That collective non-surprise is the single most damaging piece of cultural evidence in this entire story. Because when a scandal breaks and the culture responds with a shrug, that means the culture already knew. And if the culture already knew, that means the marriage was already dead in the eyes of the people who were supposed to be its biggest cheerleaders. Cultural evidence piece number 3 came from the other side of the game. Battle rappers, plural, started subtly weighing in on social media. Not with names. Not with direct references. But with cryptic posts, with knowing emojis, with quote tweets that said just enough to confirm that the battle rap community had been sitting on this information for a long time, waiting for it to become somebody else's problem to break open. That is how you know a secret was not just a rumor. When an entire sub-community has already processed it and is waiting for the mainstream to catch up, that is not gossip. That is documented history that just had not been published yet. Cultural evidence piece number 4 is the most quietly devastating of all, and it came from Papoose's own peers. Because within 24 hours of the livestream, veteran rappers who normally stay out of couples' business started posting subtle prayers, subtle support, subtle affirmations pointed clearly at Papoose. Not at Remy. At Papoose. And in hip-hop, where cosigns are currency, that kind of quiet coordinated support is not accidental. That is the industry choosing a side. That is the culture deciding, in real time, whose story it believes. And now I know what some of Remy's Day One supporters are going to say to me right now. They are going to say, but Remy is a legend. Remy went to prison and held her head. Remy came home and rebuilt her career from nothing. Remy deserves the benefit of the doubt. And you know what? I hear you. I actually respect that argument, because loyalty is a real virtue and Remy has earned real loyalty from real fans. But loyalty cannot override audio. Loyalty cannot argue with a voice note. Loyalty cannot delete a recording where you admit, in your own voice, what you have been denying in public. And that is the wall every defense of Remy this weekend has run into. Because Papoose did not accuse her. Papoose did not speculate about her. Papoose played her. On live. In her own voice. Saying her own words. And once your own voice becomes the star witness against you, no amount of loyalty from anywhere is going to close that case. Every piece of cultural evidence this weekend pointed in one direction. The industry knew. The peers knew. The battle rap community knew. And the woman at the center of it all was the last person to accept that the secret was no longer a secret. That is how empires fall. Not with an explosion. With the slow, quiet realization that everybody in the room already knew the ending before you started the sentence. Now I need you to sit up in your chair, because this is where the video shifts. Because if we stopped here, if we just talked about the affair and the punch and the receipts, we would be doing what every basic reaction channel is doing right now. And you did not come here for basic. You came here because this story is not really about a marriage. This story is about a business and a system and a machine that has been quietly grinding up hip-hop couples for the last 20 years while nobody was paying attention. So let me put on my other hat for a minute, because we need to talk about the industry layer, the layer that 95% of the internet is completely missing. Angle number one is the business timing. Because there is a growing whisper, and I have been sitting on this all week, that the reason this whole thing exploded specifically this weekend, and not a month ago, and not a month from now, is because a specific business deal was reportedly about to close. A brand partnership. A television opportunity. A specific commercial door that was about to swing open. And somebody, somewhere, wanted the truth out before the ink dried on that paperwork. Somebody wanted the world to see who Remy really was before a company put its name behind her. Nobody is saying it out loud yet. But if you follow the timeline closely, the timing is not a coincidence. The timing is the message. And the message, whether you accept it or not, is that somebody in the shadows decided this weekend was the deadline. That is not a divorce. That is a strategic corporate assassination disguised as a domestic dispute. Angle number two is the paperwork problem. And this is where Cam and Maze turned their podcast into a masterclass that every young couple in hip-hop needs to listen to on loop. Because after they laid out the weekend, they pivoted hard into a conversation about prenups, financial literacy, and generational wealth. And they said something that a lot of people in the culture do not want to hear. They said, plainly, that in black and brown communities, there is real, deep, generational pushback against prenups. Real cultural resistance. Because for a long time, prenups have been sold to us as unromantic, as suspicious, as the thing you sign when you already know it is not going to work. And that mindset has quietly cost the culture generations of wealth. While other communities are locking up their assets, passing down property, protecting inheritances, and building empires that survive divorces, our communities are watching entire fortunes get split in half every time a marriage falls apart. And when I say fortunes, I do not just mean money. I mean masters. I mean publishing rights. I mean brand equity. I mean the ability to leave something behind for your children that a courtroom cannot touch. That is what is at stake in this Remy and Papoose situation. Not just who cheated on who, but who ends up owning what when the smoke clears. Angle number three is the streaming economy angle, and this one is the deepest cut of all. Because in 2026, an artist's public image is directly tied to their playlist placement, their sync licensing, their brand deal pipeline, and their algorithmic visibility across every platform. And when a public scandal breaks, especially one involving infidelity and violence, the algorithm responds. Playlists get quietly adjusted. Sync opportunities go cold. Brand partners quietly step away and reassess. And an artist who spent a decade building a certain image can watch that image get repriced overnight by machines that do not care about her legacy. So when Remy went scorched earth on Instagram this weekend, she was not just fighting her husband. She was fighting the algorithm. She was fighting the sync agents. She was fighting every corporate partner who was watching in real time and quietly updating their internal risk assessments. That is the part nobody in the reaction comment sections is talking about. Because the reaction comment sections are looking at the drama. The industry is looking at the balance sheet. And the balance sheet is not sentimental. All three of these angles, the business timing, the paperwork problem, and the streaming economy fallout, connect back to one single truth. Remy and Papoose were not just a couple. They were a small business, a brand, a two-person corporation with revenue streams, brand equity, and long-term contractual obligations. And when a two-person corporation implodes in public without proper legal infrastructure, the losses are not just emotional. They are catastrophic in ways the average viewer will never see, because the paperwork happens in rooms without cameras. But make no mistake. Somebody is losing millions this weekend. Somebody is watching deals evaporate this weekend. And the person losing the most, based on every industry indicator we have, is not the man who kept quiet for a decade and finally spoke. It is the woman who spent the weekend screaming into her own microphone while her own voice was being used as evidence against her. Which brings us to the reveal. The thing I have been walking you toward from the very first sentence of this video. Because everything we have talked about, every piece of surface evidence, every layer of cultural response, every angle of industry breakdown, was pointing toward one single, undeniable, absolutely devastating truth. And that truth is this. Papoose was not reacting this weekend. Papoose was executing. There is a difference. A big one. A quiet man who reacts throws a punch and regrets it. A quiet man who executes throws a punch and then plays the voice notes. And the voice notes, my friends, are the entire ballgame. Because when Papoose got on live and pressed play on those recordings, what the world heard was not a wife defending her honor. What the world heard was a wife, in her own voice, admitting to a 2-year situation with a battle rapper, panicking because her husband had just physically knocked out that same battle rapper, and reportedly explaining, on tape, that she now had to stay close to the man she was allegedly about to leave in order to make sure he did not press charges. Sit with that for a moment. Sit with the full weight of what that means. Because in a single phone call, allegedly captured and preserved, Remy reportedly admitted to the existence of the relationship, admitted to a plan to end it, admitted to the interruption of that plan by her husband's actions, and admitted to a strategy of continued contact with the other man for damage control purposes. That is not a confession. That is a full case file. In her own voice. And Papoose, quiet as he has been for a decade, sat on that file until the exact moment the entire internet was watching. Then he pressed play. And Cameron, listening back to all of this on his podcast, said what everybody was thinking. He said, shout out to Remy for even trying it, because the audacity of the argument, the sheer creative gymnastics of the explanation, was almost impressive. It was gaslighting with a bow on it. It was manipulation with a rehearsed script. And Cam, laughing but not really laughing, said he had to sit that particular one out, because that one was too much even for him. And that laugh, if you listened carefully, was not amusement. It was disbelief. The disbelief of a Harlem legend who has seen everything in this culture and still could not believe what he was hearing. Because what Remy said in those voice notes was not just damning. It was strategically catastrophic. It confirmed everything. It closed every loophole. It answered every question her supporters were desperately trying to keep open. And it did all of that in her own voice, on her own phone, in a conversation she thought was private. That is not just the truth bomb of this weekend. That is the truth bomb of the entire era. Because it proves, once and for all, that in 2026, there is no such thing as a private conversation. There is only a conversation that has not been played back yet. Every phone call is a potential exhibit. Every voice note is a potential headline. Every whispered explanation is a potential closing argument in somebody else's live stream. And Papoose, the man who almost never spoke, understood the algorithm of this era better than most rappers who make a living talking. He understood that in a war of receipts, the person who documents wins. Every single time. There is no exception to that rule. And Remy learned that lesson this weekend at a cost that no bracelet, no pawn shop receipt, and no Instagram screenshot will ever be able to buy back. And this is why the hero of this story is still standing. Because throughout every second of this weekend, from the first whisper to the final voice note, Papoose never lost his composure. Not once. He never raised his voice. He never cursed his wife out on live. He never threw a low blow at the mother of his children. He walked into that camera with the calm of a man who had already accepted what he was about to lose and was determined to protect what he had left. His name. His reputation. His children's understanding of who their father is and what their father stood for. And that is the discipline the culture keeps forgetting matters. Because in an era where every rapper is trying to go viral by screaming louder than the last one, Papoose reminded the entire industry that the quietest man in the room is almost always the one holding the most powerful thing. Which in his case, was a phone full of recordings that he did not have to explain, because they explained themselves. Papoose is the guy who did every job to 100%, quietly, for a decade. He raised the kids. He stood next to his wife at every event. He never took the bait when other rappers tried to pull him into their nonsense. He built his little corner of the culture the right way, brick by brick, without a viral moment, without a chart-topping single, without a streaming award. And this weekend, that decade of quiet discipline paid off in the most public way imaginable. Because when the storm hit, he did not have to build credibility. He already had it. When he spoke, people believed him, not because his voice was loud, but because his history was clean. That is what integrity looks like in a culture that has forgotten what integrity is worth. One person spent the weekend screaming into her phone. The other person spent the weekend pressing play on hers. One person burned down a decade in 72 hours. The other person watched the flames from a safe distance because he had already moved his valuables out of the building years ago. That is the difference between reacting and preparing. That is the difference between panic and patience. That is the difference between building a brand on emotion and building a life on documentation. And every young man in this culture who is watching this video right now needs to understand that the lesson of this weekend is not that women cheat and men get hurt. The lesson is that in a world where every phone is a courtroom and every conversation is a potential exhibit, the person who takes the time to move quietly, protect their peace, and keep their receipts is the person who walks out of the storm with their reputation intact. Papoose is going to be fine. Papoose was always going to be fine. Because a man who has spent a decade being underestimated has spent a decade preparing for the exact moment when the world finally decides to pay attention. And this weekend, the world finally paid attention. And what it saw was not a man broken by his marriage. What it saw was a man freed by the truth. That is the hero of this story. That is who the culture should be studying. Not the noise. The silence that came before the noise, and the peace that comes after it. But do not get comfortable, because this story is not over. Not even close. Because everything we saw this weekend was the opening act of something much bigger, and I have two very specific things I am watching for in the coming weeks that you need to be watching for too. The first thing is the paperwork. Because when a public marriage of this magnitude breaks down this loudly, the legal filings that follow are almost always more damaging than the live streams that preceded them. There will be filings. There will be requests. There will be counter-filings. And every single one of those documents is going to be public record, which means every single one of them is going to be dissected in real time by every hip-hop analyst on the internet. And when those documents start dropping, the story is going to shift again, because paperwork does not lie the way social media does. The second thing I am watching for is the battle rapper. Because that man is still out there. Still walking around. Still connected to this whole thing. And the moment he decides to speak, for himself, in his own voice, on his own platform, whatever version of this story we think we have is going to be rewritten from a completely different angle. Somebody is going to leak the next screenshot. Somebody is going to drop the next receipt. Somebody, somewhere, is sitting on more voice notes, more recordings, more evidence, waiting for the right moment. This story is not a divorce. This story is a saga. And sagas do not end. They pause. And this pause, right here, right now, is the calm before something none of us are ready for. So make sure you are subscribed. Turn on the bell. Because when the next chapter drops, and trust me, another chapter is coming, you want to be here first. Not last. First. And on the way out, click that video coming up on your screen right now, because I broke down the exact moment 3 years ago when the industry started quietly betting against this marriage. And if you connect what I said in that video to what you just watched today, you are going to understand something about the machinery of hip-hop that most fans will never see. Watch it now, because once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. And in this culture, seeing the pattern is the only thing that separates the people who get played from the people who play the game. See you in the next one.